Hello and welcome to the Free Mind Podcast with Seth and Nova Reddy. This is Stephen Robles, and we have a very special episode for you guys this week. We have a special guest interview with Nancy Pearcey, and she'll be coming very soon. But if you have not heard of Nancy, she's the author of the recently released book, Love Thy Body, answering hard questions about life and sexuality. Her earlier books include The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and 2 ECPA Gold Medallion Award winners, How Now Shall We Live and Total Truth. Nancy's books have been translated into 8 languages. She is professor and scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University. A former agnostic, Pearcey has spoken at universities such as Princeton, Stanford, USC, and Dartmouth. She was highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today and was hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. We're so excited to start talking to her in just a moment. And before we do, we'd like to just tell you one more time about Impact 360. It's actually ironic. Nancy was just on a podcast. The Impact 360 has a podcast. Right. If you have not heard that yet, we'd encourage you to go subscribe and listen. Again, great apologetic reference there. But impact360.org is a great website where they have the online courses that you may have heard us talk about before, about truth, worldview, Gen Z, and everything in between, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So we encourage you, go to impact360.org, and when you sign up for one of those online courses, use the promo code FREEMIND for a whole $25 off.
Come on.
That's
Hey,
your neighbor.
I need y'all to give the slow clap. That was the best intro I think I've heard Brother Stephen do it thus far.
Thank you,
job,
One take,
Stephen.
y'all. One take. He's
One
legit.
take. Yay.
But we did see him on that she did this interview on Impact. We did not steal your idea, Jonathan, if you're listening.
Yes, we love you, Jonathan.
It just happened to work
Love
out.
Impact.
So God must be on the move with
Yes,
this.
That's right.
Great minds
That's right.
think alike. Well, about a week and a half ago, I was in my kitchen doing some work, and I got a text from a friend that said, "Hey, Nancy Pearcey's in town." And I said, "Wow, Seth, Nancy's in town. Can I go?" And we had so much going on, but we were like, "Yes, you need to go there." So I rushed. I had about 40 minutes to make it to the lecture, and I walk in.
40, you had like 15.
15, right? Felt like 15. I rushed, got dressed, and made it there. And I tell you,
Just to jump
Sure.
in, if I could ever get you to get ready that fast for anything else in life, we'd be in business. I've never seen her get ready so
listen,
quick.
I
She was
ran out
excited.
the door, GPS in hand, and walked into such a great lecture. I mean, everyone had pen and pads out, just taking great notes because the information was so impactful. So Nancy, we're so grateful that you took time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I enjoyed very much meeting you at that event.
Thank you, Nancy. Okay, can you tell us a little bit about your story and how did you go from agnostic to becoming one of the leading Christian intellectuals today of our time?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you started with that question because I didn't get a chance to give that personal side when I gave the lecture that you heard down at the Lakeland Christian School. So I love to be able to tell my story because I'm so excited about the way God acted in my life. I was raised in a Lutheran home, but I don't know if you know how it's like to be raised in an ethnic home. My parents were Scandinavian, and so the Lutheranism had more to do with being Scandinavian than a real personal commitment. Kind of like all Italians are Catholic.
Sure. Yes, I get that.
So yeah, exactly. There was not a lot of real spirituality in a home. And when I was in high school, going to a secular public high school, I just started asking questions. How do we know it's true? In fact, that's the only question I was asking. How do we know it's true? Because I had secular textbooks, secular teachers, secular friends. And it seemed like, how in the world can Christians claim against this vast secular culture we're in that we're the ones who have the truth? It seemed a bit implausible. And so the sad thing was that when I talked to the Christian adults in my life, none of them had any answers. You must realize apologetics was just not very well known back then. And so I talked to a Christian university professor, and I thought, he should have thought deeply about why he's a Christian. And when I asked him point blank, why are you a Christian? He said, works for me.
Yikes. Wow.
That's it. That's it. And then I had an opportunity even to talk to a Christian seminary dean. And I thought, certainly he will give me something more substantial. And all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm.
And so it was just a psychological phase and you'll outgrow it. And, I thought, well, why don't you have answers to my doubts in that case? So it was a very intentional act on my part. I said, if I don't have good reasons for knowing Christianity is true, then I should not say that I'm a Christian. I mean, you would say that about anything. If you don't have good reasons for it, you shouldn't hold it. And so I very intentionally, about halfway through high school, set aside my religious upbringing and embarked on a search for truth. I decided, I guess it's up to me to find out what's true, and I'll have to just investigate all the religions and philosophies that are out there and see if I can come up with what I think is the best candidate for truth. And so it was a couple years later, I was going to school in Europe. We had lived in Europe when I was a kid. And so I wanted to go back. I really liked it. And while I was there, I stumbled across the ministry of Francis Schaeffer, which is in Switzerland.
Oh, yeah.
And he was, it was the first time I had ever encountered apologetics. And I was stunned. I had no idea that Christianity could be supported with reasons and evidence and good arguments. I had never encountered any Christians like that. And what's more, I should tell you, I'd started really studying philosophy since Christianity had let me down. I had,
right.
Yeah,
I had decided maybe the place where people even ask these questions is in philosophy. That's where you ask questions like, what is truth?
Yeah.
How do we know it? Is there a foundation for ethics? Or is it just, what's true for me and what's true for you? And I had come pretty rapidly to the conclusion that there were no answers. If there was no God, then clearly there was no basis for ethics. There was no basis for purpose in life. We're just an accident, created by natural forces on a rock flying through space. Sure. So there's no ultimate meaning or purpose to life. And I even came to skepticism. In other words, if all I have is my puny brain in the vast scope of time and history, then how could I think I could attain universal, objective truth?
Wow.
Ridiculous. I thought that was clearly ridiculous. So I had already totally accepted all kinds of secularism and relativism and even skepticism by the time I went to L'Abri. And so again, L'Abri was the first, Francis Schaeffer's ministry is called L'Abri, which is French for the shelter. It's in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. When I arrived at L'Abri, I was really primed with all these secular isms. And again, I'd never encountered Christians who even knew about these secular isms, let alone have answers to them. And so that was very impressive. I was very impressed. I was so impressed that I left.
Okay.
I said, uh-oh. I stayed a month and then decided I need to get away because I was so attracted to the form of Christianity that I saw there. Now, you guys would appreciate this. Not only was Schaeffer known for his apologetics, he was known for his endorsement of the arts.
Way cool.
And I was in Germany studying at the Heidelberg Conservatory, studying violin.
Oh,
that's awesome. Pretty
so,
cool.
Yeah, so the music and art part of L'Abri was also very attractive.
Wow.
And I was afraid I might be drawn in for emotional reasons, and I did not want that. Christianity had let me down once before, and I was not going to go there again unless I was absolutely intellectually convinced it was true. And so, but through L'Abri, I discovered there was such a thing as apologetics, and so I continued reading. Like I discovered C.S. Lewis. I'd never heard of him before. G.K. Chesterton and others. Yes. And eventually I decided I had learned enough to be intellectually convinced that it was true and that, it's time to Schaeffer used to say, it's time to bow the knee before the Lord and say, okay, I give up. You won the argument is how I thought of it. You won the argument. But then I was not in a church or anything. I had no Christian friends. And so I thought, where do I find other Christians? Well, I knew some at L'Abri back in Switzerland. So I went back to L'Abri and studied there for 4 more months. And that's where I really got grounded in understanding Christian worldview and apologetics, and also the more personal discipleship side as well. So that was really the start of my Christian life. And that's why I've been so passionate about apologetics ever since, because it was such a huge part of my own conversion. And so I have just such a heart for young people who are asking those kinds of questions and who are looking for solid, thoughtful reasons, rational reasons and arguments to support Christianity. So many people just don't think they're out there, and they are, as you guys know so well. There are good answers to our questions.
For sure.
Amen.
Well, I have a few questions I'm going to bombard you with. One, is there a future for a Seth and Nervous song with a Nancy Pearcey violin solo?
Hey, L.
Yes. Great
Feature
thinking.
in the future,
Yes,
possibly.
yes.
And then two, do you have any interesting Francis Schaeffer stories, or just maybe what he was like as a person? We've kind of followed his work over the years, and I don't know. I don't know anything about him. What was he like? Maybe just some interesting thing that stuck out to you, and then we'll jump into more after that. But what would be your maybe Francis Schaeffer story or sketch for us?
The most important thing is that he was authentic.
Wow.
I have since then worked in some large Christian ministries and organizations, and have seen how easy it is for Christian celebrities to create a very impressive public image.
Wow.
But if you ask the people they actually work with, and you ask their family members, they can be somewhat different in real life. It's easy to parachute into a conference and be a talking head and come across very well.
Yeah.
But the real question is, how do you treat your coworkers? How do you treat your secretary? How do you treat the janitor? How do you treat your wife and children? Well, with Schaeffer, there was no question about it, because his home was his ministry. And so you saw him day in and day out. And of all the Christian celebrities I've had the honor to work with, he was the most authentic. He was definitely the same person in public and in private. And his the reason he started this sort of residential ministry, which was unique, right? Many people who went to L'Abri and became Christians there said that at least as persuasive as the Apologetics. The Apologetics was very persuasive, but at least as big a factor in becoming a Christian was seeing a Christian community and a quality of love that they had never experienced before.
Wow.
And that's because he opened his home to young people. And as what happened is, he was always an evangelist at heart. But when his children were old enough to go to college, and they went down the mountain, they were in the Swiss Alps, right? So they went down the mountain to university in the city of Lausanne, Switzerland. And their friends would ask them questions about God and religion. And they would say, "You ought to talk to my dad. He's really good with questions like that."
Oh, wow.
And so they would. There was a little train that went up the mountain. And they would go up the mountain to Schaeffer's home. And because it was so inaccessible, they would usually spend the whole weekend. And then they would tell their friends, and another group of young people would come up, and then they'd tell their friends. And pretty soon they were young people sleeping in all the couches and all the hallways and all the balconies.
Wow.
It grew sort of organically into this residential kind of ministry where people would come and actually watch you live day in and day out, and you had to live out your Christian convictions in the way you treated people, in your down moments, when you're washing the dishes and when you're tending the garden or whatever. And so that was a unique ministry that I think is hard to reproduce, but for that period, God influenced a whole generation of young people not just through his books, not just through his ideas, but through his life,
Wow.
through who he was as a person. And that was very unique.
Wow.
Amazing.
That's amazing. When you think about the people that have come through L'Abri, like yourself and Os Guinness and David Wells and so many others, and so many that didn't even get a chance to be a part of that community, but were impacted by the life and ministry of Francis Schaeffer. It's amazing that this guy in the Swiss mountains, there's something about the mountains, but
that's right.
I just put it on my bucket list, by the way.
Impacted so many people, man, in that direction. There's so many things I want to ask you. I got to ask you this before we move into the book. You said that apologetics played a major role in your life. Sometimes, we hear that we really, apologetics can get a bad name, sometimes for good reason, but it can often be derided as like unnecessary or even harmful to true Christian faith. But for you, you're saying it was part of the process by which you really came to Christ. And I would imagine you saw others like that, like you said, in L'Abri and other places. Could you just give a little word on that, the importance of apologetics and how it does play a part for many people in their spiritual journeys toward Christ?
Right. When people criticize apologetics for being too cognitive or too rational or something like that, I say, in that case, you're doing it wrong.
Ooh, very good. Very good.
Because for me, apologetics was life and death.
Wow.
For me, I understood very much that in order to have meaning to life, you have to answer these basic questions about who are we, where do we come from, where did this universe come from? And like I said, is there a foundation for morality? I mean, I really struggled with this on a deep personal level. How do I know the choices I'm making are right or wrong? How do I know that I make a choice today that's going to end up destroying me? Versus a choice that's going to build me up and build up the people around me. Without an objective moral standard, you don't know. Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher, said, he didn't believe in God, and he did not believe there was an objective universal moral standard. And as a result, what he said is, we're condemned to be free. And, Americans think, what do you mean, condemned? Freedom is a good thing. But it's not. If that kind of freedom, where you have no guidance for your life, no sense of right or wrong, never knowing whether the choices you're making are going to be good or bad for you. This is a condemnation. This is a terrible form of being lost, to use a biblical term. We talk about people being lost morally, but they're lost intellectually as well. Schaeffer used to say that, by the way. They're lost intellectually. And ministering to people is not just ministering to them morally, but showing them the truth intellectually as well is part of the gospel and part of the life-saving message that we bring to people. So I think if people can take apologetics out of the classroom and realize even people who are not quote unquote intellectuals still have to make sense of life. I have so many students who are not intellectuals, but they still, they're cheerleaders, they're football players, whatever. They still want to make sense of life.
Right.
And that's where apologetics comes in. It shows why Christianity makes sense, and it answers their deep, personal, existential questions about life.
By the way, Nancy, the friend that invited me to hear you that night, she and I are members of a C.S. Lewis book club together. And I just thank God for his ministry. And when it comes to apologetics, how his name seems to always come up to people who are really seeking answers and have deep questions. I think that's just really, really cool. But in your other books, you've dealt a lot with truth and big picture worldview topics. What made you decide to write a book like this one, tackling a lot of the hot button issues of our day?
Since we've been talking about Schaeffer, I will tie it back to Schaeffer.
Okay.
One of his most important insights was that the concept of truth has been splintered, been broken in half, has been fractured. And the background here is all civilizations have thought that there's a natural order and a moral order, and that the two are integrated. There's a single universe, and therefore our knowledge of the universe is also an integrated whole. But in the West, starting with the scientific revolution, many people started to say, no, there's really only one form of really reliable knowledge, and that's scientific facts, empirically verifiable facts.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what does that do then to moral and theological truths? They cannot be stuffed into a test tube or studied under the microscope. And so many people concluded they're not really truths. They're just personal opinion. And if you get on Twitter today or Facebook, you'll find that view is so common.
Mm-hmm.
People think they'll say that's just your opinion. That's just your subjective view. Keep it to yourself. And so, and Schaeffer helped Christians to understand this was the major barrier to the gospel message today, is that when you tell them Christianity is true, they no longer know what you mean by truth.
Wow.
Then, as soon as you start talking about theological, moral truths, those don't qualify as truths. And he used the imagery of two stories in a building to show how truth had been split in half. He said in the lower story is science and reason, which is thought to be testable, objective truth. And then all other forms of truth, including aesthetic truth, by the way, since you guys are artists.
Yes.
Aesthetic truth, moral truth, theological truth have been thrown into an upper story where they're not really truths. They're just subjective experiences, personal preferences. And so as soon as you start talking to a secular person or even a lot of Christians about a Christian truth, they automatically, unreflectively, sort of knee-jerk reaction, they throw it up into their mental upper story and think you're talking about, well, this is what makes me feel good. You know, this is what gives my life meaning. And they'll say, well, that's nice for you. I'm glad you find meaning that way, but they don't think it has any purchase on them because they don't think it's an objective truth. Now, I write about this division. This turns out to be incredibly helpful in understanding the secular mind and what we're up against. So I wrote about it in my book, Total Truth. That's the whole theme of the book, is how do we understand this split view of truth? And when I went to, I wanted to write a book on the arts, so that's Saving Leonardo. And to my great surprise, when I started reading art historians, they said art has been split into two major themes.
Wow.
Unbelievable.
The first one I read was an intellectual historian who called it the idealist stream in art versus the naturalist stream in art. And you can kind of figure naturalism will be lower story. Dealing with, these are artists who think they have to follow the lead of whatever the scientific worldview tells us is true.
I see.
And then the idealist stream in art, which is the romantics, who said no, we don't want to be just materialist and scientific and naturalistic. We want to retain some kind of a realm of meaning and morals and humanity and free will and so on. And so art itself split into two parts. And I thought that's amazing, and I wrote about that in Saving Leonardo. And then I started reading about ethical issues, and sure enough, the same division is crucial for understanding ethical issues. It might be easiest if I jump in with an example. Let's take abortion. It turns out that the most important strategy for understanding secular arguments for abortion is that even the human being has been split into two parts. So that, for example, if you read the professional bioethicists, the ones who really frame our culture's thinking on these issues, they will admit that life begins at conception. They'll admit it. The evidence from science, from genetics and DNA is too strong to deny it. So how do they get around that fact of science? Well, they split the person into an upper story and a lower story. They say, okay, the lower story is where we talk about science, right? So on the scientific level, biologically, physiologically, chromosomally, human, the fetus is human. Yes, we acknowledge that. But they'll say that's not enough to qualify for legal protection or to have moral status. Instead, the fetus has to earn the right to life by becoming a person. And so it has to jump into the upper story where we talk about values and legal status and and bioethicists will say, well, it's not really a person until it's developed certain cognitive abilities, mental abilities, a certain level of self-awareness, cognitive functioning, and so on. And so what they're saying is a fetus can be human at one point, but not a person until sometime later. So clearly these are two separate things. So it's that division that is at the heart of the arguments for abortion today. And Christians, unless Christians understand that, they will not be effective in countering the pro-abortion rhetoric.
Wow.
Amazing.
That's so instructive. And, so after we found out we were going to have you on the podcast, Nerva and I binge read your whole book, Love Thy Body, this week, which we highly recommend to everyone.
So good.
Stephen did not get to binge read it because he actually has a real job and 3 kids. But we did actually go through the whole thing. And what I noticed was how you connected each of these issues that can seem unrelated, like transgenderism, homosexuality, the sexual revolution, hookup culture, all that stuff. You connected it to this deep-rooted worldview issue. And I love the analogy that you gave in the intro where you said often these kind of hot topics are like the waves of the ocean, where the real movement that's going on is at the tectonic level beneath. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what was so instructive about this book, is you connected it to that split in Western thought at the level of modernism / enlightenment, postmodernism / romantic, and how that all connects. How do you tie this to Darwinian evolution and teleology? And maybe you could explain for our listeners what teleology is and how the materialist Darwinian evolution theory led to kind of these ideas and these splits.
As you can see from the example on abortion, what secular bioethicists are really saying is that as long as you're merely human, putting merely in quotation marks there, as long as you're merely human, you have no rights. You have no right to life. You have no legal status, no right to protection. As long as the fetus see, this is what is hard for Christians to get around their minds around, because we typically argue, well, wait a minute, the fetus is human. Well, the cutting edge arguments on the secular side today say, sure, it's a human, but it's biologically human. And as long as they say that, they say it's just a disposable piece of matter. It can be killed for any reason or for no reason. It can be used in research and experiments. It can be tinkered with genetically. It can be picked through for sellable body parts, as Planned Parenthood does, and then tossed out with the other medical waste. So being human is no longer seen as enough for human rights. And then you say, wow, why did the secular culture come to have such a low view of being human? And the answer to that is what you just raised. It's the Darwinian view of evolution. Because essentially what Darwin said is that the human being is a product of mindless, purposeless forces, and therefore the body has no intrinsic purpose that we're morally obligated to respect. And the mind is free to use it any way it wants. And so this is where you have to push this argument back even into science. There was a quote that I used that when you heard me the other night, Nerva, from the New Yorker magazine, and it said, "The loyalty oath of modernity," which is quite a grand phrase. The loyalty oath of modernity is that Homo sapiens are without purpose, and then they actually use the word telos. It's without human life is without purpose or telos. And telos is the Greek word for purpose or goal. And that's where the word teleology came from, the word you just mentioned. So teleology just means purpose-driven, or having a purpose, a goal. And I would say what Christians need to argue is that science itself shows that living things are made for a purpose. I mean, it's very obvious that eyes are made for seeing, ears are made for hearing, wings are made for flying, and fins are made for swimming. In fact, modern genetics tells us that the entire the development of the entire organism is driven by an inbuilt purpose or plan. And so what Christians are saying is we need to take our lead from what we can know objectively about science. If you are pro-science, then you should be pro-life.
Amen. Wow.
Well,
that's a switch right there, because typically, when I was coming up, so I remember taking biology in high school, and that was one of the sources of my original struggle with the truth of Christianity. Was I was obviously taught Darwinian evolution, and I saw the implications of that mindless, purposeless process and what it meant for the rest of life. And it's, they teach this, we're weaned on it in Western civilization, and it sort of sets this trajectory up to remove all the upper story that you talk about from life, and really sets us up for the dichotomy that you talk about between being a human and then having this upper story of being a person. And so you can see how all this follows really from our education, which is really interesting. But did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, I started watching this series on Netflix called One Strange Rock. It's hosted by Will Smith. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's talking about how the Earth came to be. And so often they have these astronauts on there talking about it, and they say it's luck, luck, luck. All this, we were so lucky that the Earth was made this way and that we were made this way. And it's incredible how they can suspend kind of belief and just say, it's just chance. But one of the questions that we were looking at was that view of Darwinism that kind of lowers the value of the human body. You have said that Christianity actually has a high view of the body compared to that secular view. And so can you explain that a little more? What does it mean that the Christian has a higher view of the body?
Yeah, this is interesting because I've had a few people, on reading my book, Love Thy Body, have found this one of the more difficult things for them to accept, because they have been so trained with the idea that Christianity has a low view of the body, right? Because of the Christian ethic that says, don't do it, it's a sin, it's wrong. We have this stereotype that Christianity is mostly negative. And I even had a Christian philosopher who you will know, so he will go unnamed.
Okay.
Gotcha.
wrote a basically positive review of the book, but he could not accept this. He said, no, the secular view, the materialist view, has a higher view because it says matter is all that exists. And so it actually exalts the human body. And what he doesn't understand is, no, if the human body is a product of meaningless, mindless forces, it's just matter in motion with no higher meaning, then Richard Dawkins is right. He says it's just a meat machine. In fact, it might be good for us to get into another topic of the book, because the sexuality issues also rest on a low view of the body. And this is, again, Christians need to get their mind around this so that we can change the way we talk to secular people. On homosexuality, for example, it expresses a low view of the body, because what it's really saying is, well, even non-Christians, I've talked to a lot of secular people, even non-Christians will acknowledge that biologically, on the level of biology, physiology, anatomy, chromosomes, males and females are counterparts to one another. That's how the human sexual and reproductive system is designed. And so in order to embrace a same-sex identity is to implicitly contradict that design. It's to say, why should my body inform my identity? Why should my biological sex, as male or female, have any say in my moral choices? My body is mine. And my mind is free to use it any way it wants. And it's fascinating to me that there's actually an outspoken lesbian who uses exactly that argument to defend homosexuality. Her name is Camille Paglia, and many Christians know her because she's a well-known intellectual. Camille Paglia. And listen to the way she defends being a lesbian, being homosexual. On the one hand, Paglia rejects the sort of postmodern idea that sex is just a social construction. That she says, no, that's not true. Nature has made us male and female. Humans are a sexually reproducing species. But then she asks, and these are her exact words, she says, why not defy nature? After all, fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit. So that's the logic of the secular view. If our bodies are products of mindless, purposeless forces, then they have no purpose that we're morally obligated to respect. They convey no moral message. They give no clue to our identity and how we should act. And we can do with them whatever we see fit. So the Christian answer to homosexuality has to start with that. It has to say, no, nature is teleological, to use your word. It was designed for a purpose. Science itself tells us that nature exhibits a design, a plan, an order, a purpose. And what Christians are saying is that when we live in harmony with that purpose, when we live in tune with our biological sex, then we will be happier and healthier.
You also talk about how this split of, the human kind of the biology on the bottom and the person, the feelings, the mind on the top informs the transgender movement. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. It's even more obvious there that there's the split between the body and the person, with the body in the lower story where it's devalued, and the person or the feelings, your inner life in the upper story where that's all that counts. In fact, transgender activists argue explicitly that gender, your upper story, your feeling of gender, has nothing to do with biological sex. There was a BBC documentary that said at the heart of the debate is the idea that your mind can be at war with your body. So that's how much antagonism they see between the upper and the lower story. It's at war with your body. And of course, who wins? Who wins is your mind. And so there's even it's filtering down even to young people. Kindergartners that are being taught your body has nothing to do with who you are. It's not part of your authentic self. And I even found a website for parents raising gender-neutral children, and they've dubbed it babies. Babies. But on the website, it explicitly says there is no such thing as biological sex. No such thing as biological sex. And so, again, what should Christians' response be? It should be, why accept such an extreme devaluation of the body? And even secular people, this is good news, secular people are starting to see that that transgender ideology involves what they call body hatred. I read an interview on a secular website with a 14-year-old girl who had lived as a trans boy for 3 years. From age 11, and then had reclaimed her identity as a girl. And she said, the turning point came when I realized it's not conversion therapy to learn to love your body. And I thought, this came out, unfortunately, after my book was already in print. But I thought, what a wonderful quote that would have been for a book titled, Love Thy Body.
Yes.
It means that Christians do have a wonderful opportunity to show that a biblical ethic is based on loving the body, that it expresses a positive view of who we are as physically embodied beings.
You know, Nancy, in your book, you touch on intersex and how sometimes this can be used to, in arguments, to deconstruct gender binary. How can we equip ourselves to effectively address this when it arises, the idea of intersect?
This is such a common argument.
Okay.
New York Times just had a big article on it. It is everywhere, so I'm glad you asked it. So what is intersex? And does it imply that sex is a spectrum instead of a male-female binary? Well, an intersex person is simply someone whose reproductive anatomy is ambiguous or atypical due to a malfunction in their genes or their hormones.
Okay.
They're about 2.02% of the population. In other words, 99.98% of people are male or female. And in strictly scientific terms, that qualifies as a reliably supported biological fact. Humans are binary. And even intersex people are still discernibly, identifiably male with some malfunctions or female with some malfunctions. A tiny, tiny minority, doctors are sometimes not quite sure at birth. And the trend today is to allow them to mature until they have a greater sense of themselves. But even so, they're not a third sex. There are only two gametes. There's sperm and there's egg. There's no spectrum in between. And so our argument should be that intersex people are just people with physical differences, and the church and the society should accept them and protect them like anyone else with physical differences. They should not be used as political football by people who want to deconstruct the male-female binary. When I was writing my book, Love Thy Body, I was actually contacted by an intersex woman. And so it was great. I was very grateful that she contacted me, because then I had some personal stories to tell of intersex people, from their own mouth. And she was an intersex woman who's Christian. And she gave me this quote. It's a wonderful quote. She said, "How do you think it feels being a pawn in someone else's game? It hurts to be shoved into the LGBT camp by either side." Wow. And so I think that's what we should remember. They don't want to be treated as political footballs. And that's how they're being treated now by the transgender movement, is they're being used for political purposes without any regard for who they are, their own agenda, their own needs, and their own interests. And Christians should stand up for them. We should be standing up to protect them against this culture war.
That's so good, Nancy. Real quick, could you give us a brief description of the Christian view of the body as opposed to what we've just discussed so far, and why that makes a difference for these issues?
I might answer that by saying, focusing on the argument that, to my own surprise, has been one of the most persuasive with both my secular friends and with Christians. This one took me by surprise. The argument is based on environmentalism. And you say, wait a minute, what's the connection? And one thing we've learned from the environmental movement is that to avoid pollution and ecological disasters, we need to work with the structure of nature. We need to respect the natural order. We can intervene, but when we do so, we need to work with it and not against the natural order. In other words, we may not do as we see fit, to use Camille Paglia's words, when it comes to the environment.
Sure.
And so, in the same way, what Christians are saying is that we should respect the structure of our own biological nature, that the biological correspondence between male and female is not some evolutionary accident. It's part of the original creation that God pronounced very good, that our sexual nature possesses a language. It's part of the created order that's declaring the glory of God. And I first discovered how powerful this argument was when I was talking to a secular friend who's very much into environmentalism. And of course, they all are. It's one of those things everyone knows they should be, even if they're not. But when I said, look, we're just saying, just like you should respect the tree out there, or respect the river enough not to pour pollutants into it. We're saying we should respect our biological sex, our biological nature. And she said, "Oh, okay, I get it." And here's this very secular person who has no positive views of Christianity at all, and it worked. In fact, another surprising argument that we can also make is that feminists are starting to realize that there's a problem here. Feminists are starting to say, "Well, wait a minute. If anyone can claim to be a woman, then how can we protect women's rights?
Mm.
If you can't protect someone on the basis of being biologically female, then how can you justify protecting them? You cannot protect people in the law if you cannot define that category of people.
Wow.
And so I'm actually part of a group that is, it's a fascinating group. It's called Hands Across the Aisle. And it's conservative Christian women
Mm-hmm.
and radically leftist, socialist, lesbian, feminists. And
That's a group.
It's amazing. It's really fun. And it's amazing to find that we're connecting on this issue of wanting to protect women against the transgender ideology that says sex is a social construct. Anyone who wants to claim to be a female is a female based on just how they feel. And therefore, there's no way to protect actual biological females anymore. And so, again, if we can connect with non-Christians who are seeing the problem, that's another very effective strategy.
No, that's great. And again, for our listeners, we're talking about the book Love Thy Body, and I would just highly recommend it.
Yes.
Even the intro and first chapter, Nancy, where you talk about the high view of matter in the Christian worldview, how it's a creation of God, and how the human body was so valuable to God that he decided to, send Jesus in the incarnation to take on human flesh. And that you talk about the story of creation, fall, and redemption, and the fact that God is ultimately going to consummate it all with transformed physicality. It's not, this soulish platonic realm, but it's actually him transforming the physical new heavens and new earth. And he has such a value on matter, and that's why we value it as Christians. And I think it's a beautiful picture. But you mentioned just a minute ago about law, and as we wrap up here, can you talk a little bit about, sometimes you hear the idea we should just live and let live, but you mentioned pre-political rights. I would like for you to talk a little bit about that, and then maybe if you can briefly tell our listeners about the Equality Act and what's going on with that and how we can respond as Christians.
Well, you raised two questions there, and I'd like to answer both of them. I would like to talk for a minute about the biblical view of matter that you mentioned first, because
Sure.
I think that's so important when talking to a Christian audience. We have lost our own heritage here. And one of my students put it this way: growing up in the church, I was always taught spirit good, body bad.
True.
That's a great thumbnail sketch. And what we need to recover is the understanding that the early church also faced a culture that was permeated by a low view of the material world, though for very, very different reasons. But the early church was born into an ancient Greek and Roman culture that was permeated with Platonism and Gnosticism and even Manichaeism, which was even Augustine was a Manichae. All of these isms treated the material world as the realm of evil and corruption, and you wanted to extract yourself, escape from the physical realm. In fact, salvation in Gnosticism was defined as escaping from the physical realm. They called the body the prison house of the soul. And so in this context, Christianity was nothing short of revolutionary, because it said, no, the universe was, Gnosticism, because the universe was so evil, it taught that the universe was created by a low-level deity, in fact, an evil god. And no self-respecting God would get his hands dirty mucking about with matter. And so Christians had to stand against that very decisively. And they had to say, no, the universe was not created by an evil God, but by a good God. And therefore, it's intrinsically good. But what we no longer realize is that the greatest scandal, historically speaking, at that time was the claim that that same God not only created the world, but entered into the world and took on a human body himself. And so the incarnation is the ultimate affirmation of the dignity of the human body. And Jesus, and when he was executed on a Roman cross, we might say, well, he did escape the material world, as Gnosticism taught we should aspire to do. But what did he do then? He came back.
Exactly.
In a physical body, a physical resurrection. So the resurrection of the body is, well, as Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians, the resurrection of the body was utter foolishness to the Greeks. To them, coming back to the realm of the body was not spiritual progress. Still have the idea that heaven is going to be totally spiritual. We'll be floating around in spiritual bodies as spirits without bodies, and that's the ultimate goal, is to be free from our bodies. But the scripture does not teach that. It says that just as Jesus had a bodily resurrection, you and I will have a bodily resurrection, and God's not going to scrap the material universe as if he made a mistake the first time around. He's going to restore it and renew it and create a new heavens and a new earth.
Amen.
Amen.
That's the Apostles' Creed. Right from the beginning, the Apostles' Creed, the resurrection of the body. So what we need to recapture when we talk to our secular friends is that Christianity teaches an astonishingly high view of the physical world. I can tell you there's nothing like it in any other religion or philosophy. This is a strong point of Christianity. It's a selling point, and Christians should be absolutely excited about it. And it should be one of the things we lead with when we talk to non-Christians.
As one of our final questions too, kind of going back to full circle, you talked about Francis Schaeffer and Labrie and how that affected you going from agnosticism back to Christianity. What would you say to the American church and maybe even the mega church culture? I work at a fairly large church in Tampa. What's something that we can do or what is something the church can do differently to maybe reach the younger generations, those struggling with these secular worldviews, and how that maybe could help the church also address these LGBT issues?
Right. I think, let me answer that with another story. One of my other favorite stories in Love Thy Body was a young woman named Jean who lived as a lesbian for many years and then eventually embraced her identity as a female, and now is married with 2 children. And here's how she puts it. She said, I finally came to accept that God had made me female for a reason. And I wanted to live in I wanted to respect my body by living in harmony with the Creator's design. And so when we talk to people, including in the church, because, like I said, so many Christians don't get it either. We should always lead with the positive language. Notice the language I've been using here. Respect your body. Honor the Creator's design. Live in tune with your body. Respect our biological sex. The church is not using this positive language, but that's what's going to reach people's hearts, is when we help people to see that God wants us to have a high view of our whole self, not just the spirit. We've got that down. But that he also made our bodies, and God could have created us as spiritual beings, right? He could have had us floating around in a non-physical, non-material heaven. He could have created us that way in the beginning. Why did he create matter? You mentioned C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis says we shouldn't try to be more spiritual than God. God likes matter. He created it.
Yeah.
Which is a wonderful quote. So I think non-Christian, with both in and outside of the church, we need to lead with the positive. That one of the other stories I tell in Love Thy Body is a woman named Rebecca who experienced same-sex attraction for about a 10-year period, even after she got married to a man. And by the way, you have to say that these days.
Right.
She got married to a man.
Good clarifying.
And she discussed it with her husband. She was having, continuing to have girl crushes even after she got married. And her husband said to her, because God made you female, whatever your feelings are right now, you can be sure that you will be more fulfilled with a man, because that's how God made you. And he applied it to himself. He said, whatever my feelings might be too. I mean, I'm a man. God made me that way. And I can be sure that I will be more fulfilled with a woman. And so that was the beginning of the turnaround. That made sense. That was logical. It was logical. And so that was the turning point where she eventually, it took a couple years still, eventually was free of her, unwanted lesbian attractions. And we have to be honest with people that, it's like alcoholism. It's not like you'll never have any temptation again.
Mm-hmm.
That's unrealistic. Rebecca told me I still can't watch the lesbian scenes in that TV series, Orange is the New Black.
Mm-hmm.
That's all lesbian scenes in it. And she's like, I can't watch things like that. So, it's like not being unrealistic. Temptation is not sin, though. People may still continue to have sexual temptations of various kinds. And not everyone is promised total healing in this life. Schaeffer, since we talked about Schaeffer used to say there's substantial healing in this life, not complete healing. If you look for complete healing, if you ask for all or nothing, you're likely to end up with nothing.
Mm-hmm. I love how in your book you remind us and really paint the picture of how real the struggle is for those who grow up with gender dysphoria, and the reminder to really have compassion, even along with having these right understanding of worldviews that are driving these issues, but just to really have a heart of compassion for those that are walking through these things.
We hope you enjoyed this interview with Nancy Pearcey. We didn't get a chance to cover the pre-political rights and the Equality Act that's actually in Congress right now, but if you'd like to hear more about those topics and some other things that we talked about with Nancy Pearcey, we'd invite you to check out our Patreon account. It's brand new, just created, and we'll be adding some content there in the coming months. Interview with the Mountain Prophet, this additional episode with Nancy Pearcey, and you can find that at patreon.com/freemindfm. That's patreon.com/freemindfm. And when you become a supporter, you'll get access to these bonus episodes of the Free Mind Podcast and even more content. We'd again encourage you to rate us 5 stars with a comment review in Apple Podcasts. We ask you to do it there because it really helps discoverability across all podcast platforms. We actually had a few of you do that last week, and we really appreciate it. So go ahead and go to Apple Podcasts. If you're a Windows and Android user, you can download iTunes on Windows and give us a 5-star rating there. Again, you can follow us and comment at FreeMindFM on Twitter and Instagram, and then Free Mind Podcast FM on Facebook. Thanks for joining us this week.